Hey, today I'm going to show you how to create a finger ornament for your Christmas tree. I guess it could also just be used to create a severed finger if you need one for any particular purpose. I've tried to simplify it from last year, so I'm going to use alginate to take the finger cast instead of silicone, and I'm going to be painting this by hand rather than using an airbrush. I'm also going to reduce the amount of colours, only using a few colours to paint this. So to begin, I'm going to measure out the ratios of my alginate powder and my water, just based on what the packet recommends. I did find this packet recommended slightly too much powder. It's a little bit of a weird ratio, so maybe play it by ear as well. And I'm going to use this plastic cup to cast my fingers in. I can fit about 2 fingers in there, so I'm going to do that. If you find a smaller container for just the 1 finger, you're welcome to do that as well, but I thought it would be smart to have a backup finger just in case. I've also put a light layer of Vaseline over my fingers as a release so that they will come out of the alginate a little bit more easily. Now I'm going to pour that alginate powder into the water in the larger cup, give it a good stir, and then pour it into my smaller cup. Then I can put my 2 fingers into the alginate and make sure that they're not touching the edges of the cup and they're not touching each other. Once the alginate has set, I'm going to carefully wriggle my fingers out, making sure not to break the alginate mold. Next, I'm going to measure out the silicone to pour into my alginate mold. You do have to be somewhat fast. You can't leave it for like a day or something because the alginate does start to dry up and shrivel. So I put in 60 grams of Platsil Gel 10 A and B and just a little bit of Deadener. I find it easier to pull the fingers out of the mold if they are still quite firm. Then I'm going to add my flesh tone silicone, so I'm using the Pale Flesh Tone by Neill and a little bit of red and blue flocking powder as well. Once that is thoroughly mixed, I'm going to pour that into my finger mold. I will also swirl it around and pour out the majority of the silicone just to get that first coating over the inside of the alginate and to make sure there's no bubbles in there, and then I'm going to pour the rest of it in. After about half an hour, the silicone is cured, and then I'm going to break open the alginate and pull the fingers out of the mold. To prepare the finger for painting, I'm going to cut the fingers in half, then I'm going to clean the surface of the silicone with some Isopropyl Alcohol. I'm also going to put some Shellite or naptha over the finger just to swell the silicone up and make the finger more likely to bond with the silicone paint. Then I'm going to stick a skewer into the base of the finger and then put this into some clay so that the finger is easily paintable. Now to paint the finger, I'm going to use some Silpoxy silicone rubber by Smooth On. You can also use clear silicone cork from a hardware store. I just find it easier to use Silpoxy if I'm doing smaller paint jobs. For the painting, I'm primarily going to be using a red and a blue oil paint. For the red, I'm using Crimson Alizarin, and for the blue, I'm using French Ultramarine. You can also use silicone pigments or even Skin Illustrator liquids to pigment your silicone for this. I'm also going to be using Shellite, which is also known as naptha, to thin out my silicone paint, and then some cheap brushes that I got from eBay. These are technically nail art brushes, but these are great for using for silicone painting and then throwing out when the silicone cures in your bristles. I find these little shot glasses really handy for mixing up the paint colors. I'm going to add in some Silpoxy, a little bit of the red oil paint, and some Shellite to thin them out. Once they're thoroughly mixed, I'm going to test out the color on a piece of paper to see how translucent it is. So this is a pretty good level of translucency, but I do remember adding a little bit more Shellite afterwards to make it slightly more translucent than this. So if you're using your own finger, it's a really good reference just to see where you need to add more color. So I can see that most of the red is around the fingernail, especially on the back of the finger. So I'm going to start by adding that red around the finger, and I can see it's slightly too pigmented here. So this is when I add in a little bit more Shellite just to thin out the color and make it more transparent. I'm going to add that color more intensely around the top of the finger, around the fingernail, and then I'm going to use it slightly more sparingly around the rest of the finger to add that redness that fingers have. Next, I'm going to get some Shellite on a paper towel. I'm going to blot this finger just to remove any excess color. If I think it's gone on a little bit too heavy, this can work to take it back and make it look a bit more natural. It's also helpful to use a paper towel if you want the color just to remain in the deeper parts of wrinkles. So say for my knuckle here, I'm going to paint some red over the knuckle folds, and then I'm going to pat the paper towel over the top, and this removes most of the color apart from in those deepest parts, which gives the finger a little bit more depth and definition. Now I'm going to go back over areas that are slightly more red than the rest of the finger. So again, I'm going around the top of the nail and then the back of the finger in that upper digit. I also like to add redness into the folds of my finger and then use a paper towel just to get rid of any excess. So this is how we're looking after those 2 layers of red. Now I'm going to use the blue oil paint to add a blue layer to the finger. And this is quite transparent because the blue can come on very strong very quickly. So I start by going over that knuckle fold with the blue and then patting the excess away with a paper towel. And then also the upper knuckle fold. I just like to go into all the folds of the skin with the blue to create that depth and definition. Now I'm going to put a light layer of the blue all over the finger and then pat away anywhere that I think I've put down too much pigmentation to create that kind of mottled effect of the skin. Now I'm going to paint the fingernail with that same red. I'm going to paint like a half dome over the base of the fingernail, and again this is just copying the patterns that are on my fingernail. You can look at your own and paint what you see there if it's different. I'm also going to put a light red stripe over the top of the fingernail near where it meets the skin. Next I'm going to create a purple by mixing together my red and my blue silicone paints, and then I'm going to add the purple both to the base of the nail and along the top of the nail as well. I'm going to add some more red around the outside of the nail because I think my gloves have rubbed off some of that red while painting the fingernail. Next I'm going to add in a white paint. I only have this in a silicone pigment rather than an oil paint. You can skip this step if you want to, it's not necessary, but I find adding just a little bit of white into the fingernail does make it look slightly more realistic. So I'm going to start by painting right at the base of the fingernail. Add in a tiny bit of highlights in the center of the fingernail, and then also using this white to create the nail at the top. I've made the line a little bit too thick, so with a clean brush and just some Shellite on the brush, I'm going to thin out and neaten up that white line up top. Once that is all neatened, I want to add a little bit more red back around the nail and just amp up any redness where I feel like it needs it. And again, I'm going to come in and pat off any areas that are slightly too pigmented now. It's always a bit of back and forth until you find the right level and it looks right to your eyes. Next, I'm going to mix up a slightly more pigmented version of my blue silicone paint. I'm going to use that to very subtly paint veins on the back of my finger, and I'm going to pat the back of that line with my finger to make sure it looks slightly blurry and slightly underneath the skin. Again, it's really helpful if you look at your own veins to work out the placement and the patterns. I'm going to go back in and add a little bit more red to the nail and then a little bit more white to the tip of the nail. This is where the paint job is currently sitting, which I'm quite happy with. So I'm going to go in with a clear layer of the Silpoxy and Shellite. I'm going to paint that over the base of the nail just to make the nail look slightly more shiny and a different texture to the rest of the finger. Now I'm going to create the meaty stub of the finger, so I'm going to again use the Silpoxy, I'm going to use my red oil paint and just a little bit of the blue and the white oil paint until I find a colour that I like. I'm also going to use Shellite, but just a little bit of Shellite, so it's a little bit of a thicker paint, so you can get a little bit of texture into that finger stub edge. So after painting that on, I decided it looked a little bit too pigmented, so I'm going to go over it with a paper towel and just thin out that colouring a little bit. Once my silicone is cured, I'm going to add the blood drips using Skin Illustrator's blood tone. I find that the alcohol paints just sit more naturally and more easily on the silicone paints than the fake bloods do. So I'm going to use this to add the blood drips, and then I'm going to put a layer of the clear Silpoxy and Shellite over the top to seal it in. So I'm going to paint the edge of the finger stub first, and then I'm going to let it drip down the edges of the finger. If it looks a little bit too much, where I want to wear it into the finger a bit more, I'm going to use my paper towel with some Shellite or some alcohol just to rub it back. And once I'm happy with the blood drips, I will do that clear coating of the silicone and Shellite on the outside just to seal that paint job in. Now for the ribbon, you can pick any kind of ribbon you want really. I find that the rope ones are a little bit harder to get all the way through, whereas the proper ribbons or these plasticky ribbons go through the finger a bit more easily. Ideally, if you have a big ass needle, that's the easiest way to get the ribbon through, but if you don't, which I didn't, I'm going to use my wooden skewers for this. So I poke the first skewer all the way through, and then at the base of that, I've just got the very end sticking out. I'm going to line up the ribbon and another skewer and then push that through the hole that was just made. And then I pull the rest of the ribbon through delicately, and then I tie that into a bow. And that is how I made my hand-painted finger ornament. And to compare it to the one that I painted with an airbrush, so the airbrush has a lot more layers of paint, so I find that you can see that this airbrushed one has a little bit more subtle colouring. It's got obviously more yellows in it because I use the yellow-based paints as well, whereas the hand-painted one only uses the red and the blue-based paints. Just find that the airbrushing enables you to get a little bit more subtle colouring, but the one that we hand painted is still quite realistic and will definitely, people will know that it's a finger on your Christmas tree. And if you decide that you like the idea of these ornaments but you're unable to produce it yourself, I am selling some still. I'm not sure if that gets you before Christmas at this stage, but you're welcome to email me and I can tell you the shipping times and shipping costs and all that. I'll link that in my description box as well. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you found it informative and helpful. And yeah, let me know your thoughts below in the comments. I always love hearing from you guys. And I'll see you soon with the next video. And I hope you have a great Christmas and holiday season. All right, I'll see you guys next time.